Reid, it's a real pleasure. I'm not even going to try to introduce you other than say I'm so delighted that you're here, delighted to have met you. It's now been more than a year, and love the work that you do. And I'm hoping that everybody will be equally excited about hearing some of the things you have to say about the Disability Equality Index and your work in general.
Awesome. That was an awesome panel. Thank you, everybody. Paolo, are my slides good to go? Yeah,
Yes,
we're
they are.
good. Okay, fabulous. So I'm super excited to build on that last conversation by drilling down on the concept of disability, which I was so excited and thankful to hear all of you address in various ways. And so I'm incredibly excited to bring the kind of full weight of disability in, which I have the incredible pleasure of representing today, into this conversation. And so I really want to focus on the value of research on disability inclusion in industry, which is what I do here at Disability In. I'm hoping today to share a little bit about the organization by way of sort of contextualizing the types of data that we produce about disability in industry and in the workforce. I'm going to kick it off with a little bit about my own background and the way I come to the disability community. Then I'm going to lean into kind of what do we know about disability in industry now? And then how does that drive our research agenda and our theory of action about broader social change through corporate intervention? And then tell you a little bit about what we measure and get really granular about the types of things that we're collecting across our partner companies and how all of this rolls up into exactly where you guys just left off, which is furnishing a business case for disability inclusion. And so we know that there are a lot of very well circulated and read business cases for diversity inclusion. And this is a specific one that we do with some of our data sources and disability to answer that tough question that you guys posed in the last one. That was nice. You threw them like a real softball at the end there. Disability In is an extraordinary organization. We are a leading global NGO and nonprofit organization based here in the US, but we have this extraordinary network of unbelievably committed multinational corporations, about 550 corporations that are working to expand opportunities, economic opportunities for people with disabilities across business enterprise. And so we do this from a variety of different mechanisms. We do this through partnerships. I think like a lot of you, it sounds like our work is super similar in troubleshooting like hard stuck areas around disability. A lot of this is sort of stigma busting and myth busting about these old antiquated ideas that people with disabilities can't work. And if you can't see the screen, I'm doing some very emphatic, sort of air quotes here. And that was built on this idea that in an earlier type of economic formation, when economies were more industrial, when they were in person, when they were analog, that there were so many barriers for people with disabilities, especially mobility disabilities, to participate in those kinds of economies. But all of that logic has flown out the door now that we're living in a knowledge, information, digital, remote economy. There is no reason why people with disabilities cannot participate meaningfully and fully and actually add tremendous values to basic business structures in today's economic environment and globalized sort of systems. And so we work with consumers in the design process, employees in supply chains to look at how is disability being incorporated here. I come to this picture by way of, since I'm in a sort of a room full of researchers and research consumers, I get to use like big academic words like positionality. So I do want to just sort of share a little bit how I came to the party of disability inclusion. I have a disease called cystic fibrosis. And so I spent a lot of my life, I still do, in and out of hospital systems dealing with some pretty severe respiratory infections. And I want to sort of illustrate how I came to this and what this means, especially in the context of business inclusion for a second. So I'm going to share a picture of my husband and my 3-year-old here. And they are like big, outrageous outdoors people. My husband is like a kind of a wild backcountry. He doesn't even like ski at resorts like normal people. He'll like ski 18 miles into the woods in the middle of nowhere and do like outrageous things. And he is so into this outdoor culture. And after truly almost 20 years of asking me, hey, do you want to go mountain biking? Do you want to take a chairlift to the top of a mountain and careen down on a bike? Do you want to ski 18 miles in the woods? I said, no, every time. I said, no, every time. And finally, he said, I think that, or he said, I realize now that you live your world is constructed in your mind, and mine is in my body. And I realized at that moment that he was capturing this sort of disability experience in a really poignant way, because I can't do those things. Those are not things that are sort of on the menu for somebody with a very severe and degenerative respiratory condition. So I spend a lot of my life in and out of hospitals. I spend a lot of my life getting ready to be really sick when I don't know when it's coming. Dealing with major surgeries and hours a day of respiratory therapy that I also have to balance with being a working person, for whom having a job is a critical piece of my like drive to stay alive and stay healthy, and having a spouse and doing all the other things that people do on a day-to-day basis, which for me also includes having two sort of children. And so I just want to say that I think that this is a really important way for us to ground the conversation in why disability is actually an asset to business. And so when I just think about my case and how I came to this, I have an incredibly well-refined set of communication skills, because since I was like, 3 years old, I've had to figure out, how do I talk to physicians? How do I engage? How do I read my x-rays? How do I deal with the insurance companies on the phone for hours and hours a day? I've had to make incredibly complex decisions because of these very high stakes moments where things comes to a head, and I've got to make a quick and smart decision about my own health and future and ability to stay alive. I've had to be incredibly disciplined in my everyday work. And this routine translates into incredible efficacy in the workplace. Like, I'm constantly planning for the other shoe to drop. I don't know at any time that this cold I have right now could be me in the hospital for 4 weeks on Friday. I never know. So that kind of disciplined urgency to getting things done, because I have constantly been fighting a low life expectancy, outliving it, and then wanting to outlive it again, right? So this sort of like urgency and fire, all of these things, the communication skills, the decision making, the discipline, the urgency, that is just one example of why people with disabilities bring so much to the workplace, right? And they have so many marketable and frankly monetizable skills that businesses should be looking for, right? And that's just me from the chronic illness perspective. I think about my friends that have mobility disabilities and the incredible sort of like problem solving that they're doing at any one time. I think of my colleagues who have autism and the way that their minds are able to sort of perceive problems and troubleshooting in ways that are so fundamentally different than my sort of neurotypical linear thinking, and what an asset that is. And this list goes on and on and on. So I want to start there by just level setting that we're not sort of making up for some deficiency or some deficit, but this is like a genuine asset, as we know is the case, by the way, for all sort of diverse segments within our society, and what it means to sort of navigate from a liminal perspective or some sort of marginalization on the basis of access or social norms or behaviors and attitudes. So I wanted to start there because I think that is so important. And I know you all know this, but I just still think it's worth articulating, since disability can be newer for some of us, right? There's like a big tendency here to euphemize, to sort of not say the word. I totally invite everybody to like say the word. That's why we call ourselves Disability In. We are in this conversation and we are so frank about what it means. So I just wanted to sort of start there. And then I want to go into what do we know about disability in industry research. And so let's start with sort of this big problem, how we think about disability. And there's sort of 4 nested layers here. So for anyone that can't see the screen, there are sort of 4 nested layers of ways in which we can talk about disability being underrepresented. The first is that we know there is a large scale underemployment of people with disabilities in the United States. So there is not equal employment on any level when we look at any sort of age bracket in the economy. And then within that, there are also incredibly low levels of self-identification among persons with disabilities in anyone's workforce, right? So if you know that, up to 25% of your working age population are people with disabilities, the numbers that you're going to see self-disclosing are 0.5%, 1%, 2%. There's a gross representation within the underrepresentation. This translates to a chronic absence of disability in the way that companies are talking about their annual diversity or sustainability reports. So the mentions of disability are really missing in these conversations, where there are now robust year-over-year trends where we're looking at gender identity, or we're looking at race and ethnicity, right? We think about the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission and the sort of mandated disclosures there. Disability lags in that space as well. And then I would say writ large, we also have this underrepresentation of disability in the broader definition of this conversation that we're all here to have, that it's not always part of the conversation around what diversity means. And so when we get a little more granular, we see that people with disabilities remain the world's largest underrepresented population at 15% of the population, or 1 billion people. We know that within the US labor force, only 22% of people with disabilities of working age 16 to 64 are currently employed, and many, many more are underemployed within that 22%. We know that disability remains grossly undercounted. So even among our partner companies who are actively working at this, we see usually only 4% of employees are willing to put this out there and self-identify, even through an anonymous or confidential survey. I think we see that people with disabilities are much less likely to work in leadership positions. But then here's the clincher. Over the past 5 years, right, since 2020, the number of employed people with disabilities has risen by over 1.5 million people. And this actually represents a 41% increase in the number of college-educated hires. So since the pandemic, since the shift to remote work, since these more inclusive, you just talked about mental health, since a lot of these conversations have gone mainstream, we have seen a huge shift in disability employment. And, this is also when we think about Gen Z and their willingness to sort of talk about these social identity factors. 22% of Gen Zers are identifying some form of neurodivergence as they're coming into the workforce. So like you said, with 2043, there's just a plain old demographic imperative to talk about disability differently. But then I think it is worth noting here that there's a very sort of profound lack of consensus about what exactly is disability data, right? Like, what is self-identification? What does it mean to talk about disability in the workforce? So I want to flesh through some of that in a little bit. One of the other sort of key pieces that we look at here when we're defining disability is also this idea about public transparency. So what are people putting out there? Right? There are not any sort of like legal frameworks that say you have to disclose this. The closest thing we get is the revisions to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which mandate that any federal contractors of the US government need to be working towards a 7% utilization goal across job groups. And so this has translated to sort of a trickle of public reporting about disability. So my team and I recently looked at the disability reporting trends of the US Fortune 500. And in their most recent like CSR, ESG, or impact report, we found only 10%, pardon me, of the US Fortune 500 are disclosing quantitative metrics about disability, where they're telling us what percent of their population has disabilities. And so that is a very, very paltry number, right? Only 10% of US companies are accustomed to disclosing this. I'll talk a little bit about the multinational dimensions of this, but we do see that number is a lot higher in Europe. It's more like 30% of European companies are in the habit of disclosing information about disability. So I want to talk a little bit about our theory of action, because one of the sort of premier, I think, sort of themes in any conversation about DEI practitioners these days is around kind of what is happening in the broader political landscape. And I want to sort of start by looking at disability and its theory of action. So the disability rights community, of which disability and as sort of the business stepchild, emerged really and drew on the playbook of gay rights, women's rights, civil rights, to say we want to sort of fight for the basic access and infrastructure in American society. And that was canonized in the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the landmark legislation that protects disability rights. Disability In, as an organization, has evolved out of that to say, hey, look, so it's been 35 years, it's been 34 years. We have seen that there are now protections for people's basic civil rights, but that hasn't really changed the specter of employment, about economic opportunity and access. And so our organization was born to sort of correct that gap by working with the most influential actors in society, with corporations, with major brands, with household products to say, if you're setting the tone on disability in your own workforce, on your corporate board, in your supply chain, that has the ability to sort of move the needle for genuine economic inclusion in a way that going and fighting through the courts hasn't. It simply hasn't happened yet, right? So there has to be this sort of concerted action between legislative and um, and market forces. And so we do this through a variety of ways. We do a lot of recruiting in the workforce, working directly with companies, pulling people with disabilities into those companies. We do that through our supplier diversity programs and certifying disability-owned businesses to get at the entrepreneurship dimension. We do this by working inside companies on their accessibility and their digital infrastructure to make sure it's accessible to persons with disabilities. I'm so psyched to show you all this graph, since we're in a data convention here, that shows us that our Inclusion Works team, which is a sort of family of companies that are part of our consulting apparatus, have created 382,000 individual hires over 10 years of persons with disabilities within our corporate partnership network. So that is an incredibly actionable way of documenting hires of more people with disabilities entering the private sector, entering corporate workforce. I also think it's worth saying we look at this throughout the lifespan. So while it sounds like this conversation is very focused on workforce data, I think it's also worth mentioning that there is a big play here for the role of investors and institutional investors to be thinking about how they are turning the screws or using companies as a lever to affect change, and also corporate boards, right? And what does representation look like on corporate boards as a key play to increase representation in the workforce, and vice versa. But I want to skip to the goods here and talk. I can share a little bit more about our policy agenda with anyone that's interested, but I want to spend the last few seconds really focusing on the ways that we measure disability in the workforce and how companies are doing. And this is through our index, or our benchmark, called the Disability Equality Index. And so this is an incredibly detailed, comprehensive annual survey that's sort of akin to like a gender pay gap analysis or a racial equity audit, where you take a hard look in the mirror to find out how are we doing by people with disabilities in our workforce practices and policies. And so what we do is we ask this incredibly detailed set of questions around these categories about culture and leadership, which gets at the question around self-identification and data disclosures. We look at your accommodations policies. What are you doing for accommodations for mental health, for parental leave, for disability, short-term, long-term, for mental health? How are you accommodating all of these factors and forces in the workforce? We look at employee benefits to make sure that they are going well above and beyond federal standards for disability benefits. We look at both digital and physical accessibility measures for your physical spaces and offices and plants, and making sure that those are accessible to persons with mobility disabilities, as well as designed in many ways for different neurotypes. We look at digital accessibility, and is your website usable to somebody who accesses the internet with a screen reader, right? Is your social media accessible? Are your apps, are your procurement processes designed to be accessible to persons with different ways of accessing the internet, different sensory assistive technology? We've also looked a lot at supplier diversity, and are you employing people with disabilities throughout the supply chain? We look at recruitment and whether you are actively recruiting persons with disabilities. We also look at the role of disability inclusion and sort of authentic representation throughout your marketing and communications practices, as well as how you are creating structures for career development for persons with disabilities in the workforce. And so what this index does is it provides this incredibly comprehensive roadmap I'll share it in the chat after this, for any consultant who's looking to sort of integrate disability into the way that they think about holistic consulting. It provides a roadmap for companies who want to say, oh God, where do I even start with this project, right? And it provides just sort of a way to like map out what does it look like to do disability right across enterprise. And what we do is we collect information on this from over 850 multinational companies, and we publish this epic report each year that sounds like would be an awesome fit for this community in terms of seeing what is the state of disability trends. So if you're working with a company that says, oof, what are accommodations? You could say, well, look, you got to fall in line because 85% of your peer companies are already doing this, right? And you can use it as sort of a benchmark to understand how to start the conversation around some of these things. And then I want to close by just saying that what we do is we take the results of this index and we take those top performing companies that we have seen over the last 7 years have the strongest commitment to disability inclusive practices and policies. And we isolate out of those 850 companies the top 100 performers, and we look at their financial performance, and we find that those disability inclusive top companies are generating 1.6 times more revenue over this term period, twice the economic profit, 2.6 times the net income, and 25% more productivity or revenue per employee. And this is a study that we repeat every 5 years with Accenture's data analysis team to look at what is the advantage to the business case for disability inclusion. So as I wrap up, I will throw it back to Leslie, our host, and thank you all for giving me a few minutes. And then maybe I'll throw some links into the Zoom chat if anybody wants to follow up, including my email address, because I'd love to be in chat with anybody here. So thank you.
Thank you, Reid. That was amazing. I am a huge fan of anything and everything disability. I do believe that you cannot have a DEI conversation if you are not speaking about disability. So thank you. Great information.
And thank you, especially given that I could tell that you're, you know, when I heard your voice, it was like, oh, she's got a cold. That's not good. So do I.
Something in the air here.
Anyway, really blown away, really wonderful. Thank you, Reid. Thanks, everybody else.